Hello and welcome to Channel Legendarium. My name is Robert Stiles, and I'll be telling you about mythology, literature, and folklore. For the first episode of this show, I chose A Christmas Carol, seeing as how we are coming up on the Christmas season. A Christmas Carol is one of the most famous and best-loved stories in the English language outside the New and Old Testament. It tells the story of a bitter miser named Ebenezer Scrooge who hates basically everything except money. He has a temper fouler than an outhouse and a heart colder than the Russian winter. However, everything changes for him when he is visited by three spirits, the ghost of Christmases past, present, and yet to come. By the end of their visits, he is a changed man. There is symbolism and significance to all three of the ghosts. In the text, the ghost of Christmas past is portrayed as ever-changing, sometimes with 20 heads, sometimes with one. This is meant to represent the changing nature of memory, as we either forget things or we choose to remember or misremember things as being better or worse than what they were. The ghost of Christmas present bears a strong resemblance to Father Christmas, a proxy in the United Kingdom for Santa Claus. And the ghost of Christmas yet to come is basically death, and represents the physical and spiritual death that awaits Scrooge should he fail to change his ways. A Christmas Carol was written by Charles Dickens, who was born in 1812. At the age of 12, he was sent to work in a bootblacking factory after his father was sent to debtor's prison. Though he worked there for less than a year, it made a great impression upon him. He had to spend 12 hours a day pasting labels onto bootblacking bottles all day, every day. The factory itself was very horrible to work in, as the basement was filled with huge gray rats, some of which were bigger than cats. In addition, Mr. Dickens did not make his experience easier for himself because he considered himself better than the working class boys he toiled alongside, made no secret of how he felt, and, well, you can guess how he was treated after that. Despite this difficult start in life, Charles Dickens was able to become a law clerk, a court reporter, and finally a best-selling novelist. In 1868, he scored a major bestseller when he wrote Oliver Twist, a book read by Queen Victoria herself. In 1842, he took his wife and his two children on a tour of the United States, which started in Boston, went as far south as Richmond, as far north as Quebec, and he even went to the far western city of St. Louis so he could catch a glimpse of the American prairie. While Charles Dickens relished his trip, and I'm sure his new family did as well, it was very expensive. And to make things worse, Charles Dickens' last two books had not been well received and underperformed in sales. So Charles Dickens badly needed a hit. And for inspiration, he turned to the poverty which had briefly afflicted him as a child. The 1940s in the United Kingdom was known as the Hungry 40s, as work was very scarce and many people were reduced to begging in the streets, borrowing money from extremely difficult lenders, and even turning to lives of crime, much like the characters in Dickens' Oliver Twist. The Hungry 40s could also be called the Filthy 40s. Most streets in cities like London and Manchester had open trenches where human urine and feces would flow down. Whenever it rained, the contents of these sewers would flow across the streets. Huge rats, sometimes growing as big as cats, and pigs freely roamed the streets. Some people even reported seeing persons living and sleeping in rooms that were filled with mountains of their own feces. So the next time you want to complain about your life, it would be good to think about that. Now, one of the most famous characters from A Christmas Carol is Tiny Tim. It might be easy for modern readers today to think that this is just a way for Charles Dickens to tug heartstrings, but the children of Dickens' England did suffer very high rates of malnutrition because of the joblessness that afflicted much of the middle class. Martha Cratchit is not nearly as well known as Tiny Tim. However, her character was based on a plight faced by many working-class girls. Martha Cratchit, Bob Cratchit's oldest daughters, works 12 hours a day in a milliner's office, sometimes 16 when they get close to the Christmas season. There were many girls in the United Kingdom, just like Martha Cratchit, who had to work more than full-time jobs in order to help support their families. And there were many others, like Tiny Tim, who faced malnourishment because of their fathers being paid low wages. Furthermore, there were even boys as young as 8 years old forced to work in the coal and tin mines of Western England and Wales, effectively being used to haul ore carts out of the mines. Now, about 300 years before Dickens' time, during the Protestant Reformation, Christmas had been strongly discouraged by the new government. The new Protestant leaders of England regarded Christmas as being a Catholic holiday, which did not have a clear biblical justification. So they didn't want much to do with it, and they discouraged Englishmen from practicing Christmas, sometimes using bulls and muskets. However, by the mid-Victorian age, the 1840s, Christmas was making a comeback. The English middle class saw it as a time to celebrate family togetherness, to give thanks for what they had, and a chance to also attend church services and sing Christian hymns. However, Mr. Dickens argued that their concerns should extend beyond their own families and to the many poor who lived sometimes only miles away. And as we've seen in earlier slides, the numbers of the poor were legion at the time. For inspiration, Charles Dickens turned to a real-life miser named John Elwes, who lived during the 1700s in England. Even though he was one of the richest landowners in England at the time, John Elwes was quite possibly one of the cheapest men who ever lived. During his life, he was said to have wrestled a dead rat away from a bird so that he could eat it instead of paying for real food. He would ride his horse through forests and raw wilderness to avoid paying the tolls at different roads. Even when he died, he refused to pay for a candle for his doctor to see, and his physician had to write out notes by moonlight. One of the most famous lines to come out of A Christmas Carol is "Bah humbug," Scrooge's dismissal of Christmas. However, humbug meant something very specific in Dickens' time. Humbug meant that you were accusing somebody of false goodness or faking sincerity in order to get what they wanted. So when Scrooge told Cratchit that Christmas was a humbug, he was claiming that Christmas was nothing more than an excuse for Bob Cratchit to pick his pocket every 25th of December. When Scrooge called his nephew Fred and his effort to bring him over for a family Christmas dinner humbug, he was expressing his belief that Fred was only inviting him over for dinner because he wanted to get something out of him. And before we move on to the next slide, I want to call your attention to the middle slide, which portrays the ghost of Christmas Present with his two children, Ignorance and Want. Charles Dickens was calling attention to the fact that the upper and middle classes of England were profoundly ignorant of the poor, who lived sometimes less than a mile away. Indeed, he warned Scrooge that doom was written across the brow of the boy Ignorance, because a day could very well soon come when the girl Want would become so strong and so terrible that the poor would have no choice but to take what they needed from the rich, which would obviously be a dark day for Scrooge. Indeed, by inspiring charitable giving, Charles Dickens was both hoping to forestall a popular revolution that would turn his country upside down, but he was also criticizing a popular theory among the middle class and upper class of England written by this man, Reverend Thomas Malthus. Reverend Malthus argued that the reason why poverty was so common in the United Kingdom was because there were too many people. Too many people? not enough food and work and housing to go around, so therefore you have poverty. It provided the middle and upper class of England a way to not only explain the poverty that was so common in their country, but to give themselves an excuse for not doing anything. One of the lesser-known lines in A Christmas Carol comes from The Ghost of Christmas Present. Of course, Scrooge's words to the two solicitors who come asking for charity are well known. He tells them, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" And when the solicitors answer that many of the poor would rather die than go there, Scrooge replies, "Well, they'd better hurry up and decrease the surplus population." When Scrooge referred to the surplus population, he was invoking the words of Sir Thomas Malthus. However, a later scene in the book sees those words thrown back in Scrooge's face. The Ghost of Christmas Present takes him to see Tiny Tim. When Scrooge expresses his concern that Tiny Tim may die, the Ghost of Christmas Present declares, "Man, if you truly be man in your heart, forbear that wicked cant, until you have learned where the surplus population and what the surplus population is. There may come a day when heaven may decide that you are more wicked and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child." Oh, to hear the ant upon the leaf declaring that there are too many lives among his hungry brothers in the dust. So in that line, Dickens provided a sharp and cutting rebuke to those who use Thomas Malthus's theories as an excuse to not do anything. In making his most famous book, Charles Dickens spared no expense. He gave the book a red leather cover, he gave it gilt lettering and corners, and he even hired one of the most famous illustrators in the United Kingdom, John Leech, to provide the illustrations. Many of the illustrations that you've seen in this presentation have in fact come from Mr. Leech's original work. Ironically, these extravagant spendings helped to drive the cost of the book up so high that many of Dickens' working class fans were unable to afford the book. So let's hear it for irony. Despite the high price, though, A Christmas Carol was a big hit, selling all 6,000 copies of its first edition within days of publication. Unfortunately for Mr. Dickens, because of his high spending on the production of the book, he didn't see many profits. However, the critics were almost universally favorable. The Victorians indeed declared A Christmas Carol to be a new gospel. Many solicitors and charitable workers noticed that there was a sharp increase in giving from the well-off in the years following A Christmas Carol's release. It also helped to make the celebration of Christmas much more popular and much more widespread in England, effectively putting the gas on the mid-Victorian revival of Christmas. It is fair to say that Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol is a gift to the world. The book has never been out of print. Its lines and scenes are almost universally recognized. It has been adapted over 20 times for film and television. And that's the end of my first episode of Channel Legendarium, A Christmas Carol. Thank you for listening, and of course, a Merry Christmas to you and yours.